When a decorated soldier was denied boarding while escorting a fallen comrade, what began as a quiet standoff at an airport turned into a national reckoning. This is the story of Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Brooks, a man who stood still for dignity, and in doing so, moved an entire country. Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Brooks stepped into Houston International Airport on a sunlit morning, the polished leather of his shoes clicking rhythmically against the floor. He had seen everything in his 30 years of service, from Afghan battlefields to diplomatic halls in Berlin, but today was different. In his case, wasn't luggage, but military transport orders and documentation, authorizing him to escort the remains of Private Ryan Keller, a 19-year-old who had died during a peacekeeping mission. Outside on the tarmac, a flag-draped coffin awaited. The morning sun shimmered across the stars and stripes. Elijah whispered, "No one gets left behind." That wasn't just a motto, it was a vow. This wasn't a flight, it was a promise. Adjusting his uniform and posture, he walked toward the airline check-in counter. What he didn't know was that this journey would become a storm. One that would ignite a nation and expose truths many had grown too comfortable ignoring. The check-in area was busy with the Monday morning rush, but Elijah's presence had a gravity that parted the crowd around him. Dressed in his full uniform with polished brass and ceremonial stripes, he was the embodiment of discipline, honor, and sacrifice. As he stepped up to the counter, a middle-aged woman with a name tag reading Gwen looked up. Her expression was neutral, practiced, as if she had served thousands of travelers before. Elijah offered a courteous nod. "Good morning. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Brooks. I'm escorting Private Ryan Keller. Here are my orders and identification." She took the documents, scanning them with a faint wrinkle between her eyebrows. She glanced at the screen, then back at Elijah. "One moment, please," she said, her tone unchanged. Her fingers tapped across the keyboard with speed and familiarity. Then they stopped, her brows furrowed further. She looked again at the documents, then at Elijah, and something changed. A stiffness in her posture, a delay that had nothing to do with technology. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, voice quiet. "There seems to be a problem with your travel clearance." Elijah raised an eyebrow, not confrontationally, but with the quiet authority of a man who had weathered worse. "What kind of problem?" She hesitated. "The system flagged something with your identification. It might be a security mismatch. I'll have to call my supervisor." The pause between her words said more than the words themselves. Elijah knew that look, the look of someone who wasn't sure what to do with a man who didn't fit her expectation of a military officer. Black, proud, decorated, and unbending. "I'll wait," Elijah said, stepping to the side but refusing to move far. He kept his eyes on the flag behind the counter, gently fluttering in the air conditioning. A flag that meant something, at least it used to. A small crowd had begun to form, not around him, but near enough to notice. A man in a suit glanced at him curiously. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering something in his ear. One young woman lifted her phone slightly, her camera pointed his way. He stood straight, hands behind his back, not a muscle flinching. His patience wasn't just military, it was principled. But even patience had limits, especially when silence tried to mask injustice. Gwen returned, this time with a balding man in a wrinkled shirt and a lanyard that read Supervisor. His nameplate said Randall. He didn't offer a handshake. "Colonel Brooks," he said, glancing briefly at the uniform before shifting his eyes to the documents. "I'm afraid we're unable to verify your security clearance. There's a procedural hold on your ticket." "That's not possible," Elijah replied, his voice calm but pointed. "I've escorted remains 6 times. My credentials are valid. This isn't protocol. It's a stall." Randall didn't flinch, but his throat bobbed. "We're following procedure." "That's not what you're doing," Elijah said, taking a step forward. "You're hiding behind it." The tension in the air grew taut. Phones began to record. Whispers moved like ripples through the terminal. And somewhere near Gate 14, truth prepared to go airborne. The moments that followed were defined by stillness, but not the kind that soothed. It was the kind of stillness that blanketed a battlefield before the first shot, a pregnant pause, the quiet tension before the unraveling. Elijah remained still, rooted in purpose. His mind was disciplined, alert. Every instinct told him this was no simple misunderstanding. He had seen this play out in foreign embassies, on checkpoints in Kabul, and now, on American soil, in a place that should have honored the uniform on his chest. He felt eyes on him, curious, conflicted, concerned. A young woman, maybe early 20s, stood 3 passengers back. Her phone was already angled upward, screen flashing "Live" in red. A caption below it read, "Soldier denied boarding. No reason given. Watch this." The view count ticked up in real time. To Elijah's right, a veteran with silver hair, cane in one hand and a U.S. Marine Corps cap on his head, slowly stepped forward. "This ain't right," the veteran muttered. "Not for someone carrying a flag-draped coffin." Gwen looked up nervously. The dam had cracked. The room didn't erupt. Not yet. But it was listening now. The old Marine didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his words settled like smoke over the gate area. Elijah turned slightly, meeting his eyes. A quiet acknowledgement between 2 men who knew what it meant to wear the uniform. "You served?" Elijah asked. "Nam, 3rd Battalion. My best friend came home in a box. You think I don't know what this is?" The man tapped his cane on the ground. "This isn't about policy. This is about perception." Gwen shifted awkwardly behind the counter, caught in the crossfire of dignity and fear. Randall returned with a clipped tone. "We're still working on it, Colonel. Please remain patient." But the crowd wasn't patient anymore. Phones were recording. Murmurs became questions. A woman in a red scarf stepped forward, voice trembling with fury. "Why are you stopping a decorated officer from bringing home a fallen soldier?" Randall opened his mouth, but nothing came out. From across the terminal, a woman shouted, "My brother died in Fallujah. He didn't get the honor this soldier's giving today. Let him fly." That was the spark. The terminal's silence broke, and the storm that followed wasn't chaos. It was conscience. The murmurs had become a chorus. The once orderly check-in zone now buzzed with the energy of reckoning. Phones flashed like lightning bugs in a summer field, recording, broadcasting, immortalizing the moment. Randall stepped back, the pressure mounting. He reached for his walkie-talkie, speaking in low tones, but his eyes darted across the growing crowd. Gwen's fingers hovered uselessly over her keyboard. There was no protocol for this, no script to follow when the public turned into witnesses, and the room began demanding more than policy. Elijah remained still, yet every part of him pulsed with discipline honed over decades. He hadn't moved, hadn't yelled. He didn't have to. His presence had become protest. Then came a voice from deep within the gathering. "Sir, are they saying you're not allowed to fly?" It belonged to a young woman in business attire, barely 30, holding her phone high. "Are you being stopped because of race?" Elijah looked at her and said, "I'm being stopped because silence lets systems stay broken." The crowd absorbed that, and then, as if on cue, a security officer approached, but not for Elijah. He leaned into Randall and whispered something that made the supervisor pale. Whatever the officer whispered into Randall's ear made the blood drain from the man's face. His professional mask cracked. He gave Gwen a subtle nod, and she stepped away from her station. Elijah could see it now. Panic was setting in. Not because they realized they had done wrong, but because the world was watching. Across the room, several news stations were setting up. Someone had tipped off the media. A CNN affiliate, a local ABC crew, and even an independent veteran-led news outlet were preparing to go live. The woman live streaming earlier, her stream had hit 70,000 viewers. One of the reporters, a man with graying hair and combat boots beneath his suit pants, approached Elijah. "Colonel Brooks, would you be willing to speak?" Elijah considered it. He hadn't planned on becoming the face of anything. But as he looked around, at the faces of strangers now acting like allies, and at the empty promise of that gate behind him, he nodded. "Only if you let me speak first to the people here." The reporter stepped aside. Elijah turned to the crowd. "Let's be clear. This isn't just about me. It's about who we are, when no one tells us what to say." Elijah stepped onto a row of nearby seats, elevating himself above the growing crowd. Not out of ego, but necessity. The cameras found him, the phones aimed, and for a moment, the airport terminal became a courtroom, a stage, a sanctuary. "I've served this country for 30 years, he began, voice clear but not boastful. And in all that time, I never imagined I'd face my greatest obstacle not on the battlefield, but at home, in the place where I was supposed to be respected. He paused. I'm not here for recognition. I'm not here for privilege. I'm here for Private Ryan Keller, a 19-year-old who will never see his family again, who gave his life believing this country would remember him. A few people covered their mouths. A woman began to cry quietly. The Marine veteran leaned his weight on his cane like it was a rifle in a foxhole. I came here to bring him home. But this, he gestured around, this is not home. Not if silence wins. Not if bureaucracy replaces humanity. He stepped down slowly. The room stood still. And then, like the thunder following lightning, the applause erupted. What followed next was unlike anything the airport had ever seen. Airline executives flooded the concourse. A regional manager tried to calm the crowd, but was booed. The woman who had live-streamed the confrontation was now fielding interview requests from national networks. The hashtag number "Let Him Fly" trended within minutes. Behind closed doors, the airline's legal and PR teams scrambled to control the damage. Statements were drafted and deleted. Lawyers whispered about liability, but it was too late. Then the airport's loudspeakers crackled. Attention! Gate 14 is now under operational delay. We apologize for the inconvenience. No one moved. They weren't waiting for a flight. They were waiting for justice. Elijah stood near the counter, not budging. A child walked up to him and handed him a small American flag from a backpack. For the soldier, the boy said. Elijah knelt and nodded. Thank you, son. He'd be honored. Every camera in the room caught it, and the world watching felt it. The crowd parted again, but this time, for something different. 3 uniformed military officers entered the terminal, moving with urgency and purpose. Their insignia bore the stamp of the Pentagon. The lead officer, a woman named Colonel Marissa Hale, walked straight to Elijah. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, she said, voice calm but firm, we've been authorized to take over your mission. The Department of Defense has secured transport for Private Keller. Randall, watching from behind the counter, blanched. We have a C-130 waiting. We'll depart from the private side of the tarmac. Full honors. No further delays. The entire terminal erupted in cheers. A chorus of applause, tears, and spontaneous salutes filled the space. Elijah nodded once, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Randall. It didn't have to go this far. Randall said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The walk to the private terminal was like a procession. Passengers, employees, veterans, and strangers followed silently behind Elijah and the officers. The honor guard awaited at the gate, their white gloves spotless, their boots aligned like rows of gravestones. As the casket was moved, every civilian present stood in the still reverence. Elijah turned to face the crowd one last time. I didn't do this alone, he said. You all stood with me. And because of that, a soldier gets to go home the right way. He saluted, not just to the flag or the casket, but to the people who had found their voice in that terminal. And as the engines of the C-130 rumbled to life, Elijah walked aboard, his shoulders straight, his conscience clear. He had fulfilled his mission. But the story was just beginning. By the time Elijah's boots touched the tarmac of the military base, where Ryan Keller would be received by his family, the country was already in motion. The video of the confrontation had amassed millions of views. News outlets were running full-day coverage. Politicians from both parties were issuing statements, some genuine, others clearly pressured by public outrage. Veterans groups began mobilizing. Hashtags like "We respect the uniform" and "dignity" in death flooded social media. Military families wrote open letters. And perhaps most powerful, Gold Star mothers began speaking out, sharing stories of bureaucratic disrespect, lost paperwork, and delayed returns. Elijah kept to his duty, quiet amid the storm. At the base, he stood in crisp formation, saluting as Keller's family embraced the flag-draped casket. The mother wept into Elijah's shoulder and whispered, "You gave him the dignity we couldn't." He simply replied, "We all deserve better." The events at Houston Airport had become more than a headline. They were now a referendum. Editorials poured in. Church sermons referenced the stand at Gate 14. Schools discussed it in civics classes. Talk shows debated it for ratings. At the airline's headquarters, meetings ran around the clock. The CEO publicly apologized, placing several executives on leave and announcing a new task force to evaluate racial bias and military policy handling. It wasn't just damage control, it was desperation. But for Elijah, the real consequence wasn't administrative. It was cultural. In barbershops, people talked about dignity. In police precincts, young recruits asked about chain of command and moral duty. At military bases across the world, soldiers watched the viral videos with a mixture of pride, anger, and hope. They saw what Elijah did, and some of them began asking, "What would I do in his place?" 3 weeks later, Elijah received an invitation with a gold seal. The envelope bore the insignia of the United States Senate. Inside, a letter from Senator Miriam Hart, chairwoman of the Armed Services Committee, requested his testimony. "We believe your experience can guide meaningful legislative reform," it read. Elijah had testified before military panels, NATO councils, and crisis units, but never something like this. Still, he said yes, not for politics, but for Ryan, for the mothers who had written to him, for the strangers who had stood beside him when it mattered. In the Grand Rotunda, he spoke simply, "No policy should override principle, no form should replace honor, and no soldier, living or fallen, should be left behind by the very people they served." When he finished, the room didn't clap. It stood. Back at the airport, Gwen, the clerk who had first stopped Elijah, watched the hearings on a break room television. Her hands trembled around her coffee. She hadn't been fired, but she had been reassigned and sent to bias training. What haunted her wasn't the backlash. It was the footage of Elijah remaining calm, even when humiliated. His words echoed in her head. "You're hiding behind protocol." That night, Gwen signed up for a community veterans outreach group. She began attending sessions with Gold Star families, and eventually she wrote Elijah a letter. "I failed to see the weight of the flag you carried. I see it now. I'm sorry. I'm learning." Elijah received it weeks later. He read it, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same folder that held Keller's transport orders. Some debts couldn't be repaid, but growth, that was a form of respect too. Months passed. One day, Elijah received a letter from a name he didn't recognize. Jorge Ramirez, age 16, San Diego. "I watched what happened," it began. "My brother is in the Army. We're Mexican-American. Sometimes people don't think we belong here. But seeing you stand like that made me want to join too. Not just to wear the uniform, but to stand for something." It ended with a drawing, a sketch of Elijah in uniform, saluting beside a casket wrapped in stars. Elijah held the letter in his lap for a long time. He had never wanted to be a symbol, but maybe the world needed more than uniforms and medals. Maybe it needed examples. And maybe, just maybe, this was how real change began. The walk to the private terminal was like a procession. Passengers, employees, veterans, and strangers followed silently behind Elijah and the officers. The honor guard awaited at the gate, their white gloves spotless, their boots aligned like rows of gravestones. As the casket was moved, every civilian present stood in still reverence. Elijah turned to face the crowd one last time. "I didn't do this alone," he said. "You all stood with me, and because of that, a soldier gets to go home the right way." He saluted, not just to the flag or the casket, but to the people who had found their voice in that terminal. And as the engines of the C-130 rumbled to life, Elijah walked aboard, his shoulders straight, his conscience clear. He had fulfilled his mission. But the story was just beginning. The story of Elijah's quiet resistance had reached the furthest corners of the military, and inside every branch, conversations began to stir. At Fort Langdon, an Air Force base in Nevada, Captain Lily Ahmed watched a video of the incident during a squadron leadership seminar. It moved her in a way that no training session ever had. She stood up during the debriefing and said, "We say no one left behind. But how many times do we watch from the sidelines when someone's honor is left behind?" Her question sparked a wave of responses, and within days her base issued a new training directive focused not just on protocol, but on empathy, dignity, and action. Across the country, change was slowly taking root. Elijah began receiving messages from young officers who said they had never been taught to intervene in situations outside combat. But now they were asking different questions. Real questions. Ethical questions. One Navy lieutenant wrote, You didn't just escort a soldier, sir. You escorted a generation into understanding what service really means. Elijah printed that letter and pinned it on the inside of his closet, where his medals used to hang. In a quiet town in Georgia, Ryan Keller's father, Marcus, stood at the edge of his son's grave, hand resting on a folded flag. He hadn't spoken to many reporters. He hadn't written posts or tweets, but he had watched every second of Elijah's testimony. He reached out to Elijah the old-fashioned way, with a phone call. "You don't know me," Marcus said, "but I just wanted to tell you something man to man." Elijah braced himself for grief, or anger, or maybe blame. But Marcus said, "Thank you for seeing my son, not just as cargo, but as someone who mattered." There was a long silence on the line. "I didn't know how to bury my boy," Marcus continued, "but because of you, I buried him proud." Elijah's throat tightened. He deserved that. They all do. Neither man said much after that. They didn't need to. Some truths are too sacred for many words. Months later, Elijah stood in front of his closet, looking at his uniform. He hadn't worn it since the hearing in D.C. The medals gleamed from within their case, but he didn't reach for them. Instead, he touched the edges of Ryan's folded orders, still in the folder marked Final Escort. He hadn't retired officially, but everyone assumed he would. 30 years was enough, but something in him stirred. Not ambition, not duty, but a need to remain present. He picked up the phone and called the regional training command. "Put me on the guest instructor list," he said. "I've got some things these young soldiers need to hear." He didn't want a classroom. He wanted eye contact, connection, clarity. He wanted to look each cadet in the eye and say, "It's not enough to salute the flag. You have to stand behind what it stands for." And one by one, he would make sure they heard it. The first session Elijah led was small. 30 officer candidates in neatly pressed uniforms, all sharp minds and sharper doubts. He didn't bring slides, no charts, just a folded flag, placed gently on a desk in the front. He asked no questions at first. Instead, he told them the story. From Gate 14 to the C-130, from silence to storm, from isolation to solidarity. They sat riveted. When he finished, a cadet raised her hand. "Sir, what gave you the courage to stand there when it felt like no one would back you up?" Elijah smiled. "The soldier I was escorting already gave his life. What was I risking? An uncomfortable scene? My pride?" He paused. "Sometimes standing still is harder than charging forward, but it's also where history turns." No one blinked. No one looked away. And in that stillness, something shifted. Not in him, but in them. On Veterans Day, Elijah received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a handmade scrapbook titled, "For the Ones Who Stand." It was filled with handwritten messages from military kids, sons and daughters of deployed parents. One letter stood out. It read, "Dear Colonel Brooks, my mom says you're a hero because you didn't move when everyone else looked away. I want to be like that, not just strong, but good. Thank you for showing us how." There was a crayon drawing of Elijah standing in front of an airport counter with a line of people behind him. Above his head was a speech bubble. "This is about dignity." Elijah wept, not from sadness, not from pride, but because in that moment he realized the truth. His mission was never just to escort a fallen soldier. It was to remind the living how to rise. One cool spring morning, Elijah found himself at Arlington National Cemetery. He stood at Section 60, the resting place of many of the fallen from Iraq and Afghanistan. Row after row of white headstones, each marking a life cut short, a promise left unfulfilled, and a family forever changed. He wasn't there for ceremony. He came quietly, wearing civilian clothes and carrying nothing but a single rose and a letter. He stopped before Keller's temporary headstone, bent down, and placed the letter beneath the rose. In it, he had written, "You were never just a soldier. You were a son, a friend, a name that will never be forgotten, and you reminded a nation that silence in the face of injustice is not strength, it's surrender." He stood in silence for several minutes, hands behind his back. A group of tourists passed, then paused, noticing him. One child asked, "Was he famous?" The guide whispered, "No, son, but he made history." And Elijah, without turning, simply nodded. Later that year, a bronze sculpture was unveiled at the National Veterans Museum. It wasn't commissioned by Congress or the military. It was crowdfunded by ordinary people moved by Elijah's story. The piece showed a soldier standing tall at an airport counter, one hand over a folder, the other at his side. Behind him, a ghostly figure of another soldier, draped in a flag, stood just over his shoulder, watching, approving, at peace. The plaque read, "For those who stood so others could rest, in honor of Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Brooks, and the ones who never walked alone." Elijah was invited to the ceremony, but stayed at the back of the crowd. When reporters asked why, he answered, "That statue isn't about me. It's about a moment, a choice, and a promise." He let others stand in the spotlight, because for him, the spotlight had never been the point. A year after the incident, a memoir was published under Elijah's name, though he had never intended to write one. The first draft began as letters to the families he had escorted, then expanded into reflections, essays, and moments stitched from memory and principle. The book, titled "Stand Still," became a national bestseller. In it, Elijah never condemned. He didn't name the airline. He didn't attack individuals. He only offered stories, each anchored in the question, what does it cost to care when it's inconvenient? Book clubs read it. Military academies adopted it. High schools included excerpts in American civics classes, and slowly the phrase, "stand still," became shorthand, not for stubbornness, but for quiet courage, the kind that changes culture, one brave act at a time. Years passed. Elijah aged gracefully, less upright in posture, but no less in spirit. One afternoon, after delivering a final lecture at West Point, he stepped off the stage and began walking through the hall. A cadet caught up with him, young, nervous, eager. "Colonel Brooks," she said breathlessly, "I just wanted to say, your story, it's why I stayed. I was going to quit. I didn't think I had it in me to fight battles I couldn't see." He turned, studied her. "And now?" "I understand that leading isn't always charging forward," she replied. "Sometimes it's refusing to move until the right thing happens." He nodded slowly, then offered her a salute. She returned it, hand trembling slightly. Not from fear, from conviction. Years later, on a misty morning in Arlington, the same path Elijah once walked as a guest was now his final journey. A flag covered his casket. The Pentagon, military branches, and even civilian leaders came to pay tribute. But the largest crowd was made up of people who had no titles, just memories, veterans, students, young officers, children who had once drawn pictures, Gwen, Jorge, Captain Lily, even Ryan Keller's father, now gray-haired and proud. As the casket moved down the line, dozens of soldiers snapped to attention. Saluting in Elijah Brooks' story reminds us that true honor lies not in medals or ranks, but in the courage to stand firm when it matters most. Sometimes the most powerful act isn't charging ahead. It's standing still in the face of injustice. Respect should never be conditional or dependent on who's watching. Elijah didn't just escort a fallen soldier. He inspired a generation to live and act with integrity. His legacy proves that even quiet resistance can echo loudly across a nation.